China announces $60 billion in financial support to African nations. President Xi Jingping is trying to reassure leaders of Chinese commitment to the continent. So how much do China and Africa need each other? And is it a fair partnership? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, is $60 billion enough to convince African leaders that China is their most reliable partner? President Xi Jingping is in South Africa trying to reassure leaders from across the continent with hard cash, which will be welcome after the economic downturn, which has forced China to slash investment in Africa by more than 40% earlier this year. Now, the theme for the summit in Johannesburg is Africa-China progressing together, win-win cooperation for common development. Well, it's a partnership that hasn't always been described as equal, with China accused of plundering Africa's rich resources. Before we bring in our guests, Tanya Page helps us to set up things from the summit in Johannesburg.
We have some of the details of that $60 billion funding injection from China to Africa. $5 billion will be in interest-free loans, $35 billion towards other loans and credit facilities, and about $155 million towards food aid in Africa. We know across southern Africa, the countries have been hit by drought, and this is already a food-scarce region, so that money extremely important. This morning, Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe described Chinese President Xi Jingping as being sent from God. That just underlines and highlights, I think, the importance African countries and African leaders place on their relationship with China. China is Africa's biggest trading partner. At the moment, about $220 billion worth of trade. By 2020, leaders here say they want that to reach $400 billion. China's interests in Africa traditionally and still continuing to be dominated by the extraction of raw materials, oil from Nigeria, copper from Zambia. However, its interests are broadening. We saw a raft of different agreements signed here involving industrialization, the development of infrastructure, the sharing of space technology, loans towards South Africa's state-owned energy company. We know the country's been hit by several blackouts over the past year and a half. So a lot of assistance being extended to Africa from China, and many pleased African leaders in the conference centre behind me.
OK, let's bring in our guests now. In Johannesburg, we have Shanti Pai, who's economist and director of Nascents Advisory and Research. In Beijing, we have Aina Tangen, political and economic affairs analyst. In London, we have Joseph Ochieno, contributor for the New African magazine. Welcome to you all. And Shanti, can I start with you, because you are in Africa in the very city where this bag of goodies has been unveiled by the Chinese president. Is this enough? Is $60 billion of what sounds like a sweetheart deal coming from the Chinese? Is this enough to persuade Africans to keep their main line of interest with the Chinese offer?
Look, I think it's interesting in terms of just thinking about how much is enough. We know that there's been a number of figures that have been bandied about, that Africa needs $90 billion a year over the next 2 decades to actually meet its infrastructure needs. So whether $60 billion in itself is enough is probably not there yet, but it's part of a progressive number, right? Because China has been here for a while. They've already been, Chinese banks are here financing infrastructure projects, even in some energy projects, and actually in many, many other areas of development across the continent. So this is only part of that contribution. But certainly, China's $60 billion is not enough. Some people are saying that, around Sentin, where this is happening, that there are deals that are probably amounting closer to $90 billion between the different businesses that are there and the business people that are acting. So $90 billion, $60 billion is not enough, but it's certainly a good start. It's somewhere close to what you need, because we need a lot of cash to make sure that the development that is needed in Africa actually takes place. So we need to progressively move faster and higher in terms of the money that comes through to the projects that are so necessary for development in Africa.
OK, and Aina, in Beijing, how do the Chinese see Africa now. This is 60 billion, as I said, of a rather delightful bits and pieces in this bag. What exactly does China see Africa as being in terms of the relationship going forward, given that they've slowed down considerably in terms of growth?
Well, the most important thing is, of course, trade. Africa is a untapped, not untapped, but a developing resource for China. And the real issue here is, how will it go? It cannot be one way. It has to be sustainable. For China to prosper in Africa, Africa must prosper as well. And this is what you're seeing this. In addition to the 60 billion that we're talking about, there's hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade, which was pushed forward also during this period through a raft of different deals that were signed in all of these countries. So it's not just about the old way of doing things, where you come in and you have a political agenda. China is really saying, as Xi Jingping said, we're allowing Africa to settle its problems the African way.
And so, Joseph, in London, it sounds all good, doesn't it? Because the criticisms that have been levelled against China over the years about them basically coming in and taking the natural resources, the commodities, and leaving very little behind in terms of developing the African communities in which they're operating. It sounds very much as though China is taking a step beyond that.
And to an extent, yes. But we also need to remember that before we started talking China, the big nation, China was generally quite engaged in Africa from the time of our independence. In fact, Mr. Mugabe actually knows what he's talking about, because the early times of apartheid, China built a major project, Tazam Railway, connecting Tanzania and Zambia. At the time, it was basically a strategic economic project, but it was a project linked politically to try and outdo apartheid South Africa at the time, and Zimbabwe, then landlocked, landlocking Zambia. So in a way, China has played a crucial, critical, and a sensible role in Africa, politically, ideologically, and economically. But yes, you're right that going forward, where we are today, I think China is right to put in a bit of money where its mouth is. As one of the other guests has already suggested, it's not necessarily enough, but I'm quite sure with the guys seated in Santon today, even if China had offered only 30 billion, African leaders would still be clapping. But we need more than that. In fact, even if China gave Africa $100 billion, the challenge for us as a continent and as a people is probably to learn lessons from China. How did China move from where it was 40 years ago to what it is today? What lessons can African nations learn? In other words, what is the little they can pick out of China and do what with it themselves?
Right. I know in Beijing, the criticisms remain, though, don't they, that China basically is involved in Africa in a project of self-promotion. It's Chinese interests, obviously, which take the priority, and that they don't engage sufficiently to actually affect positive change on the ground. Now, this is something that remains. There are many examples, but first of all, could you just respond to the criticism that remains despite President Xi's announcement in Johannesburg?
Well, there are major cultural differences that have existed long before China started coming into Africa. These were encountered by Americans and by Europeans. Quite frankly, the understanding of Africa is very poor in most nations around the world. So the idea that China is not pursuing self-interest is kind of silly. But the difference is it a zero-sum game, as was often described in earlier periods, where yes, in fact, European and American interests were, in fact, plundering. There was not much to show for it. I mean, if you start looking at authors like Dambisa Moyo in her book Dead Aid, which questioned, it was not the first to, but it definitely put into perspective the question about how aid was being dealt in Africa and how solutions were being created. I think your guest in London put it succinctly. The question is, how can Africa learn from China and these new emerging models to develop themselves?
Okay, but I mean, primarily, China's trade with Africa is about the extractive industry. It's about oil and minerals, isn't it? And the export of these commodities does not lead to development alone, does it?
No, it doesn't, and that's one of the big issues. You're seeing a trade deficit with these African countries. However, for China to continue and get past what it sees as its greatest threat, this middle income trap, it needs to have a ready market of buyers. So within Africa, they're trying to expand the economic base, 200,000 technicians to be trained in China, more industries to support it, more basic infrastructure, both power and road, so that resources can get out, but also the people within those areas who are earning money from these can be done. There's also this issue about trying to develop the processing within these countries. This value-added part would help these countries tremendously by providing jobs in areas that are long-term sustainable. This is to China's interest in the long term, because with those jobs they can buy the cheaper Chinese goods that will be competing against American, South Korean, Japanese, and European.
Okay, and Shanti, I mean, you're in South Africa, one of the two giant economies on the African continent. How would you gauge the impact of Chinese investment? Tell us something concrete that we can understand that has actually benefited the South African economy.
But I think one of the interesting things around China, because China has been in South Africa for quite a while and in the rest of the continent, is that, you know, the Chinese population in South Africa is not well entrenched or well integrated into society, and that does lead, you know, to people being circumspect about, you know, the intentions of the Chinese and Chinese business in Africa, and therefore what this or any continued business might look like. But I think the word there that is very, very important is business. That we have to understand that China is here to do business. They're quite clear to say we want to develop. They've got their own interests, and so they are here looking for opportunities. So it is up to, you know, South African politicians and African politicians and business people to say how do they carve out deals that make sense for them, that allow them to benefit. Because there's a sense there that, you know, China has the upper hand. How do we make sure that therefore that upper hand, or this sense that China is here to dominate or to take over, is actually taken care of? And that really relies now more than any other time to the locals who are doing business with China to say, look, in order for us to benefit, this will not work. That, you know, we're not just looking for people who are interested in only the extractive sectors, but in other areas of development, in fair trade, in open trade, and actually force and push against that, because clearly China does need Africa. And so if you are to negotiate, you must do that rather than to keep at, you know, the attitude that, you know, we've been beaten up before and therefore we don't trust. But to say there's a moment now to do something more, to do something better, to trade with China, to develop, to learn where there is things that can be learned. It's very, very important. And so the posture is important.
OK, and Joseph, I mean, it is incumbent, isn't it, really, upon the African governments themselves to negotiate the best deals possible. We've seen African governments almost roll over and have their tummies tickled, haven't we, when it's come to doing business with China?
You're absolutely right, Martin, and that's what I'm saying. Ironical, as I said, early independence African leaders did better deals with China. The nearest to my own homestead in Uganda are two Chinese projects, including an agricultural college, which has now been turned to a university, and then the other, a rice project, at a time in the 60s and early 70s when growing rice as a safe alternative to, for our own agriculture and food security in Africa generally was not a big thing. That was a lesson. Any other project like that to date? No. And I think your other guests asked a very important question, and you yourself did, Martin. I'm actually not quite sure. Beyond perhaps the major project, the major railway project in Kenya, what else? What are the major projects across the African continent, leave South Africa, and leave probably some of the farms in Zambia, where there are projects which are Chinese, but which are not only generating local jobs, but are sufficiently controlled majority by Africans on the African continent, except with Chinese technology, a little bit of Chinese money. We would like to be able to see a lot more of that.
Ina in Beijing, give us some evidence then of what seems to be a new kind of engagement that China wants to manifest with Africa today. I'm thinking particularly of China getting involved more politically, the peacekeeping troops in South Sudan, for instance.
Well, this is one of the things that comes with investment. You cannot just simply go in economically and walk out with the goods. And this is something that China is dedicated to. China has doubled its aid to Africa every 3 years since 2006. This is an enormous undertaking in addition to all the business deals that they're doing. So yes, China is going to continue to be a part of Africa. You'll note that they are trying to put a base in Djibouti, and this will continue as Africa spreads its footprint, not only here, but through the Belt and Road Initiative that they're pushing into Southeast Asia and across Europe.
Shanti, in Johannesburg, one of the biggest issues for all African countries, of course, is job creation. How should African governments be shaping Chinese investment in order to produce the jobs that they so desperately need?
So, I mean, I think one of the things that everybody needs to do is to start right at the point about what we need to learn from China. And one of the most important things that China has introduced to the world is this ability to plan and implement in this, very, very, very clever way. And if they did that, then the, African governments and politicians would know how it is, therefore, what they need, and how then to work with China and Chinese business to make sure that they bring to bear their own plans. So, what are the key things that, are necessary? What are the projects that are necessary to bring forward? And what are, even in terms of targets for trade and investment, how should that look and how they want that to look? And obviously, in between themselves, to make sure that they have some sense of coherence. Because sometimes, the competition itself between African states can work against them in terms of, China trying to find the best deal, and then they tend to work against each other. So one of the things that they have to do is to have a plan of action to say, where is it that we are looking to get investment, to get trade to grow, and how can then China be a partner in that sense to make sure that things are actually working? So in terms of, infrastructure, we know that China has a lot of money, has a lot of experience in terms of building infrastructure. Now, how do you make sure that those work? Now, many people have said, when China comes to develop infrastructure, they bring their own people in terms of labor, that actually there's no transfer of skills or even employment growing in Africa. Excuse me. So one of the things that they have to make sure then is to say, how do then they plan or make sure that when China does come, you are told, listen, we are looking for you to come and help us with infrastructure, but we will only allow this number of people for you to bring with, and perhaps you might have them leave over time as we develop skills locally so that Africans themselves can benefit. So these are the kinds of deals and and detail that's necessary to make sure that there is that benefit that clearly everybody's looking for in terms of China's involvement and business. But make sure that this is a business deal. This is not aid, because a lot of this idea that China is here to help, China is bringing aid. That language should change.
Absolutely, Aina, in Beijing, China perhaps more than anybody has proved the benefits of trade over aid. But I'm just wondering about whether this new type of engagement that you've been telling us about coming from Beijing, whether that will extend to actually advocating for Africa in other issues, like on issues of climate change. Currently, we've got those important talks taking place. Is China prepared to advocate on behalf of Africa as well as use it as a potentially giant marketplace?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know in the end that it can be that simple. There are so many conflicting ideas and interests that are involved in that, and a lot of it's between those who have money and those who do not. So the resource question will continue to be there. I think it's not a question of just advocating for Africa. I think it's really a question of advocating for the world. This is a historic moment when you see both the United States and China basically on the same page, some quibbles aside, about leading the world forward. Africa has to be part of that, but obviously, as they're developing, there has to be some allowances made and perhaps more sacrifices on behalf of the developed countries.
And Joseph, again, I'll ask you this question, the question that I asked Shanti earlier, and that is, how should African governments shape, fashion the kind of investment that they actually want, that they actually need from China? So actually make demands upon the incoming investment.
African leadership need to learn lessons from some of their earlier leaders, where African programs are put on terms. African leaders need to be meeting China on terms, and set the agenda. They need to be able to tell Chinese that, look, these are areas, these are the stuff that we've got, these are the products that we've got. What have you got in return? These are what we have got. This is what we like to do. A quick example. You just talked about jobs. It is extraordinary that a Chinese project, even if they brought $100 billion, the biggest challenge facing Africa is a young population and overpopulation, regardless of the fact that we have arable land. It's extraordinary that you can have a project in which more than 50% of employees come from China into Africa, whatever amount of money they come with. You know what? It is only in Africa. Chinese would not go with 10% workforce in any part of Europe simply because they're investing in a particular corner of England. But you know what? We don't have to blame China there. African leaders need to be able to take the lead. And then the point raised from Beijing, yes, these guys are coming with money, but we also do have what they don't have. We have the oil, we have the gold, we've got the land. And you know what? We've got the deals, including strategic location. Africa is not changing its location.
Aina, coming back to the Chinese domestic situation and the much publicised slowdown in terms of growth in the Chinese economy, and therefore, of course, the reduction in demand in China. It's transforming to a different type of economy, isn't it? A consumer-led economy. How is that impacting the way China sees its investments abroad, particularly, of course, Africa?
Well, it's a mistake. It's a popular mistake that China has been reducing the amount that it's brought in. What has happened is you've seen a drastic fall in commodity prices. Steel, aluminum, all of these, iron ore, more than half, oil, more than half. So it's not that China is importing less. They're actually importing more and continuing to grow. But world commodities overestimated the appetite that China would have for the future. And as a result, there was overcapacity. Now that overcapacity is having difficulties as people, unfortunately, as we've seen in OPEC today, are not dealing with the realities, the economic realities. Instead, they're addressing the political interests that they have. I think what you see in China domestically is this desire for a very, very strong, peaceful, solid world where trade can go on. China, of all nations, it's ranked in the low 100s in terms of the number of nations on a resource per capita basis. It needs to be able to get resources, yes, but it also needs to improve those resources and sell them abroad. And they're taking a much broader view of this as they try to assure partners, especially in Africa, that China is in there for the long term.
And Shanti, in Johannesburg, are you aware of a realisation or perhaps an apprehension about the consequences, the dangers of relying too heavily upon the trade being offered up by one element of the global economy? China dominates so much of investment in terms of Africa. Are there any words that you're hearing that suggest that diversification needs to occur, and it needs to occur now?
Well, I think it's interesting because I think one of the things that are being negotiated here is exactly that. Because one of the hopes, and my colleague was talking there about the idea that we all believed that China would have a continued appetite, for resources, and they would keep, binging and binging forever. And China itself, in its own plans, when they wanted, to reshape that economy and focus on domestic spending, overestimated, that their own people, the domestic appeal, in the ability for them to refocus, from a saving economy to a spending economy. Even though there's a lot of spending there, it's just not enough. And they're recognizing that as the economy slows. And they're therefore looking for alternatives to say, because it's the most important thing, that we have to diversify across economies, across sectors, across regions to make sure that you don't rely on one drive alone and think that that is a long-term plan. All these things are things about realizing that the old way of doing things has gone. And so even the complaining around whether or not we are being, colonized again is no longer sufficient, because we must move from the basis that now that we know that certain things can happen, that you can be colonized or taken advantage of or exploited or whatever the language may be. Now that we know, we've got to find new ways of doing things, new ways of doing business, new ways of negotiating, because it must be clear by now that China needs Africa as much as Africa needs China, and therefore from that premise, how do we make sure that things happen? It's no longer a discussion now whether or not we need China. We do. How do we make sure that relationship works and that everybody benefits, and stop, complaining and whining around whether or not we are about to be taken advantage of again?
All right. I sense that there's another programme in the offing quite soon on this. Can I say Shanti Pai, thank you very much indeed. Aina Tangen, thank you very much. And of course, Joseph Ochieno in London. Thank you all very much indeed for a very interesting conversation. And as ever, thank you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the programme page of our website, aljazeera.com. You can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. But from me, Martine Dennis, and the whole Inside Story team, it's bye for now.